All right, we are 2 minutes past. I will get started. Welcome. We are a small crew here this evening, but thank you for joining me. And hopefully the next little bit will be helpful and interesting to you guys. So my name is Rhianna Hughes Eddy, and I work with New Zealand Land Care Trust. And we're taking a look tonight at farm environment plans for lifestylers and small farms. So again, I work with New Zealand Land Care Trust on the West Coast as the Catchment coordinator, which involves a whole slew of different options. But the New Zealand Land Care Trust, if you're not familiar, works with farmers and landowners, so including lifestylers and small farms in the environmental space, trying to help them achieve the various environmental goals, whether it's on an individual level or a larger, say, catchment scale level. For this evening, as I go through the webinar, you guys should have the accessibility of chat and Q&A. So if you have any questions or any chat at any point, pop them in there. I'm running this thing solo though, so it may take me a while to notice those, but I will address anything that pops up in the chat or Q&A when I'm able to, and we go to some little resting points. All right, without any further ado, we'll get moving on. All right, so freshwater farm plans and farm environment plans have been and are in the just in the news and relevant to farmers. Farmers are facing some challenges with new regulations around freshwater, climate, and biodiversity requirements. However, many of these new regulations don't apply to lifestylers, runoff blocks, bush blocks, etc. Properties less than 20 hectares or less than 5 of horticulture. And you are not required to have these plans by law if you are on that smaller scale. However, we believe that they can be a useful tool to assist landowners in looking after natural values and enhancing the biodiversity and freshwater values of your property. Many areas are starting to form catchment groups, particularly on the West Coast. This is a new and a burgeoning concept, but maybe in other areas is more common. And smallholders having farm plans and working towards similar goals, we believe will help farming communities thrive together. So today we're focusing on why have a farm environment plan and how do you create that farm environment plan with that template I sent through. And there's an optional follow-up in-person workshop or other opportunity as needed. So the intent is that by the end of this session today, which is likely going to be less than an hour, the intent is that you are prepared to critically assess your property and can start on filling out your farm environment plan template by the end, and a follow-up in-person workshop or one-on-one session as needed can help you complete your farm planning with some expert advice and peer support. So again, in the email I sent you yesterday that you used to get this link, I provided you with the FEP template. We will be tracking along with the template as we go through the webinar, but no need to fill it out as we go. Feel free to refer to the sections as we move along though, if that's of interest. All right, so here's a snapshot of what other industries say with regards to FEPs. I thought it would be worth touching on these. So within Horticulture New Zealand, Horticulture New Zealand's take is that a farm environment plan supports growers to assess their environmental risks, take action where required, and demonstrate progress on environmental objectives. Dairy NZ's take is that it's a tool that can help you recognize on-farm environmental risks and set out a program to manage those risks. Beef and Lamb is aimed at ensuring they provide sustainability and profitability of your business by protecting the health of your soil, freshwater, and biodiversity. So that's what the larger industries are taking with regards to farm environment plan, separate from what the governmental take is. But really, all of those industries, it essentially comes down to the objective of an FEP is to minimize and manage the impact of our land use on the ecosystem, inclusive of the soil, freshwater, and biodiversity, as well as climate. Regardless of how we use the land, we do have an impact, but can completing an FEP or the process of this help us consider what we can tweak for a better overall outcome? So having healthy soil, freshwater, and biodiversity means lots of good things for our bottom line, for our future, and for our present. So again, a farm environment plan is a tool that can help you recognize environmental risks on your land, in your property, and set out a program to manage those risks. So some of these things you may already know, you may already be doing, but maybe the slightly more systematic approach to helping you kind of break it down a little more reasonably. So creating your FEP with perhaps maybe an understanding of the purpose behind it, it's time to get on with it. So remember to consider that an FEP is a living document, shouldn't be something that you complete and chuck on a shelf. That's not the point. The point should be to process it and understand it as we move. So grab that template that I sent you if you've got it, but no need to fill it out as we go. You can fill it out later. Our core focus as we walk through it this evening is to, though, first, acknowledge that you are what you already know and do well, and assess what practices could be improved on and how. All right, so the core details. Beginning of any kind of information is make sure you add that personal information, description of your property use and assets. Maybe add a little bit of relevant history. Was it a historically a runoff block, or was it previously converted? When was it converted? What is the history of your property? Could be relevant. Also add some photos if you'd like. It's really cool to have good photos for documenting progress and change. Next thing, a map is an essential part of your plan. Mapping of your property, though, can be as complex or as simple as you have the ability, interest, or desire, or time. There's nothing wrong with hand-drawn features over an aerial map or imagery. Conversely, there are a number of GIS tools that are available, from Google My Maps to ArcGIS type systems. The New Zealand Land Care Trust a couple months ago set out a series similar to this one of a GIS mapping webinar. So if you're interested in that, I'm more than happy to send you through those webinars and those YouTube links, and you can check that out, or you can always pay somebody else to map your land. Some other things that you want to include on your map, whether it is really small scale and just your 2-acre property or larger, things that you're going to want to map are native vegetation, areas with restoration potential, waterways and wet areas, stock crossings and laneways, areas prone to erosion and pugging, different farm management units, standoff pads, cultivated areas, holding pens, septic fields, flood zones, whatever is relevant to you and your land use. And if not already known, the map will be important to making out critical source areas, which will become important opportunities for improvement between farm systems and the environment. All right, next thing on your farm plan is your goals. What are your environmental goals for your property? Goals can be added now if you already have some in mind, or after the land use environmental risk assessments. The goal, the goal is that they will help you focus your action plan. You may like to have at least one goal for each risk or GMP, be it soil, health, biodiversity, waste management, feed management, etc. For example, you could state that you want to increase eels in your farm system, reduce bank erosion of your stream, or reduce pugging over winter. But the key thing is to remember that goals are outcome-based. They are not actions. They're much broader and may encompass many actions to meet that goal. So example would be if you want to increase eels in your stream, that's going to be a result of numerous actions to achieve that, be it reducing fish passage barriers, shading the stream so it's cooler, making sure that the stream runs naturally so you have sufficient riffles and runs and pools. Those are all the actions for your ultimate goal. Goals also help you keep focused. So if you start to wonder, why are you doing this? You're a year and a half down the line. Why is it again that I'm doing this particular action? Referring back to your goals can really keep you on track and help you out a little bit there. Also, goals are good with conversing with your neighbors. Are your goals similar? Are there some you can work together on, such as a riparian planting or creating some sort of wildlife corridor? Right, the next step, it's important to note what you already do. This way, what you need to do will be naturally highlighted, and this will help you form your actions. Remember that by trying to go straight to actions, it's likely you'll miss a heap of risks. So this is going to be your first ultimate process, is to take a look through all of these things. What do you do? what's not relevant, what do you not know more about, and perhaps need to learn a little bit more about. All right, a common thread through land management practices that are listed in that prior chart is the idea of critical source areas. Within the realm of ecosystem health, maintaining waterway health is of the utmost importance as a cultural, human health, and recreational amenity. The identification and subsequent mitigation of critical source areas is integral to developing a thorough farm environment plan. So critical source areas are the areas of your land that are prone to surface runoff and can carry nutrients such as phosphorus and nitrogen, as well as E. coli and sediment into waterways. These areas typically lead up to a drain or stream and can be gullies, swales, former wetlands, or springs. So we've got two examples of critical source areas here. So right highlighted in this yellow area is the bottom of this hill. Depending on your definition of a critical source area, you might define the entire hillside as a critical source area because it could be prone to erosion, but the primary critical source area here is that bottom where the water pools and settles and that sediment is drained into. So that's your critical source area there that you want to explore a little bit more. What's the issue? How do you reduce it? How do you manage that? It's happening, how do you then manage it? The one over here on the right, you can see that there is a gate on the right-hand side and two paddocks, and there's a water crossing of sorts. So perhaps stock are being crossed from paddock to paddock. If stock are being crossed, it's one stock being crossed once a month, maybe it's not that big of an issue, but if it's a regular stock crossing area, it's a risk. So is it an area that maybe needs to have a culvert of some sort or some sort of stock crossing management in that area to reduce that critical source area, and or that bottom left area and that leftmost paddock looks like it could use some additional fencing. All right, so the runoff from critical source areas, as mentioned previously, impacts ecosystem health in numerous areas, and different regions struggle with different challenges based on geology, climate, and predominant land use. So the impact on the ecosystem includes sedimentation, which decreases water clarity, increases water temperature, blocks photosynthesis, and damages the gills of fish and invertebrates in waterways. Nitrogen, phosphorus in excess can lead to nuisance growth of plants and algae, and extreme concentrations is toxic to aquatic animals as well as human health. And then E. coli in waterways is an indicator of fecal matter. So be it human or animal, it's easy to get E. coli into a waterway, but it's also easy to reduce it and prevent it. So E. coli being in the waterway, E. coli in and of itself is harmful, but it's actually, as much as anything, an indicator that potentially other more harmful bacteria are in that waterway, thus wanting to reduce E. coli and other contaminants getting into the waterways. And then for the on-farm bottom line, critical source area impacts are huge. And losing your nutrients and your topsoil, a loss of those is like having holes drilled in a bucket. Nutrients and topsoil are valuable to whatever it is that you're producing on your property, on your land, and their loss is unsustainable for productivity and finances. It's just not a great thing. All right, so it's important to, now that we know a little bit more about critical source areas, identify the critical source areas you have on your property. Grab your gumboots, grab that map that you created, and head out onto that property. You already likely know some of your critical source areas as that part of the paddock that takes ages to dry out, or that raceway that always scours after a good rain. But what is your critical source area? If you can't remember them off the top of your head, grab those gumboots and get out there and check them out. Things you want to be looking at is, where does the water flow? Where does it overflow? Does it risk carrying fecal contaminants with it? Does water pool in a particular area? Slow draining areas risk soil exposure if they're overused. And then where are your areas of sediment loss? Remembering that any kind of bare earth plus rain, which we have a lot of on the West Coast, and any kind of pathway to water is a critical source area. All right, good management practices are the grade practice techniques that help mitigate various land management use and practices. So as you go through the process of creating your action plan, so analyzing your land use and creating your action plan, it's good to refer to these good management practices so you're using your time and your money efficiently and effectively. Nobody who owns land, very few people who own land, have heaps of time, have heaps of money to just throw it away. So these good management practices are the agreed techniques among numerous industry providers that help manage and mitigate some of your practices that you have. And these good management practices, so I'll be running through these, the ones that you see on the screen here: stock, winter grazing, cultivation and cropping, erosion, wetlands and riparian margins, biodiversity, fertilizer and nitrogen use, and infrastructure in the next couple of slides. There is a lot of information to take in, so this is really just a brief snapshot. And also, given that we're a relatively small group tonight, I'm not going to be delving in on anything too much. So I'll go over them, but if there's anything you have of particular interest or curiosity, you want to understand a little bit more about it, let me know. We can always circle back to something as relevant. Or the other thing is, look in Appendix 1 of your template. We've linked some of the good resources on your template itself in that last page, 2 pages. The appendix links you to some specific, this is the issue you have. Here are some of the best ways that you can go about mitigating and managing that risk and that concern and issue. All right, so without any further ado, getting into these good management practices. So first of all, on stock, with relation to stock, anyone with stock will already be thinking about stock management for production and animal welfare. This good management practices is also about, though, applying an environmental lens to the impact from the stock. So thinking about stocking levels, when you think about stocking levels, you want to ensure that you have appropriate stock and the right stocking rates for your property. Too many stock results in more pollutants entering waterways, or too many stocks or the wrong stock might exacerbate compacted soil or soil pugging. Additionally, consider that fewer well-fed stock can give better returns than underfed stock. All right, so with grazing location, excluding stock from at least 3 meters of waterways, drains, and wetlands is important. And then also consider all the stock that you have best suited for your terrain. So what is the right location for the right types of stock? In regards to grazing conditions, consider adapting your grazing regime for the conditions. For example, making sure that you graze wetter paddocks earlier in the winter to avoid pugging, and drier paddocks earlier in the summer to avoid overgrazing. And last, make sure that you're taking water to the stock, not stock to the water. This, I understand, is one of the most challenging things for those who do not always already have fenced off waterways, and particularly on the West Coast here, there is abundant water and abundant practice of having stock near waterways and using that as your water source. But that's not good practice. That means the stock are in the waterways, so getting that paddock and that area and those stock reticulated waterways means that fencing off is much easier and much better. All right, getting winter stock through the winter is one of the biggest challenges farmers and landowners can face if you stock over winter. I understand that may not be all of you here. So the key here is to plan winter grazing before the winter and to use any knowledge you have about your paddocks that cope with winter to avoid the greatest impact. There are some key strategies you can use, like which direction you strip graze. From the top to the bottom means that anything that you have in your paddock that's still there is catching. Anything that's growing can help catch some of that sediment and nutrients before it reaches that critical source area. Temporary or permanent fencing of wet areas is a great way to avoid overusing wet paddock areas. Back fencing is also a way to reduce pugging, and planting catch crops or cereal grains in late winter to take up excess nitrogen and cover bare earth is another great practice. So research is currently being conducted on the West Coast, as well as in Canterbury and Southland, by Plant and Food Research into what cover crops and what best cover crops can be used in various areas. So that's just something to keep an eye out for if that's relevant to you. Finally, Beef and Lamb have provided a great webinar on this. So refer to your template for that link, and we can move on from winter grazing. Not unlike winter grazing, winter cropping, or like winter cropping with winter grazing, cultivation to reduce environmental impact requires a bit of foresight and strategy. Paddock selection involves avoiding cropping on steeper paddocks if you can, and cultivating along contours rather than up and down the slope. Sediment runoff or wind erosion is a problem during cultivation or when vegetation cover is too short and sparse, so trying to reduce bare earth as much as possible. I understand it's a kind of a recurring thing, reduce that bare earth. Also, healthy soil will reduce sedimentation, build up that organic matter, and maintain good soil structure and permeability to reduce runoff. And there are numerous ways that you could approach doing this that's most relevant to you. Be it learning more about your soil structure, so having somebody run a workshop in your area. That's something that some of my colleagues and coordinators in other areas have run, are soil workshops. Learn about your soil, learn how to assess your soil yourself. And so based on the type of soil you have, how do you manage that? Other things to look into would be dung beetles, or this one's a bit touchy in some areas, regenerative agriculture or no-till processes. There are lots of different things that you might be interested in exploring personally that could help you more with looking at ways to improve your healthy soil. And finally, don't forget to build in your buffers around your waterways. Any growth, any vegetation closer to the waterways is going to do a better job of catching some of that sediment and nutrients. All right, I have broken erosion into two separate GMPs just to clarify it a little bit more and make it a little bit more relevant to the coast or wherever you might be. So we separate it into hill erosion and stream erosion. So with hill erosion, the goal is to retain sediment on the land before it gets into the waterways. For hills, good management practices for erosion prevention mean maintaining good cover of pasture and avoiding overgrazing. Ultimately, you want to try to minimize tracks, go across the slope, keeping tracks that you might build in as flat as possible. And then some sediment loss is inevitable probably. So add cutoffs, culverts, and sediment traps where you can to catch what you can't avoid. And for sediment traps, there's some really creative approaches that have been taken and practiced and played around with to try to avoid losing all of that sediment. So it's something that's worth exploring or looking into. If you think you have some inevitable sediment loss, what are some unique ways that you can maybe build a sediment trap that can catch that sediment before it gets in, and then you can redistribute that onto your paddocks or elsewhere at a later time. Also, consider stabilizing your hills with native regeneration or plant trees on erosion-prone land, and particularly gullies. With regards to stream erosion, first and foremost, stock damage to stream banks and vegetation along the stream margin will increase the risk of erosion, regardless of your stream type and how it flows. Stock will damage it. So set some permanent fencing far enough back to prevent erosion to allow for changing stream meanders. I understand that this, particularly on the West Coast, is challenging with the types of rivers that we've got, but we still want to do the best that we can. So options for preventing or reducing stream bank erosion include hard engineering, which means structures such as rock walls, or actions such as bank reshaping, or soft engineering, which is using plants to buffer the bank. Remember that you don't want to be doing hard engineering though without checking with your council, as you may need a consent. Hard engineering, also noting, can do more harm than good, as you are altering stream flow and potentially force, and Mother Nature has a way. So it may be the right thing to do, but just consider that what are some of your potential other options before you proceed with some hard engineering. Finally, you can do some soft engineering of plants. They can be native, but in some circumstances, poplars and willows can also be used to help stabilize banks, but making sure that if you pursue either of those, that you're using good species and not invasive ones. Wetland and riparian good management practices. So if you have a wetland and riparian area, First thing you want to do in this is check where your streams run and when they're in full flow. This will help you decide where to place fences and what to plant. It will be a waste of time and money to place fences where they are likely to be washed out, or plant the wrong type of plant in a dry patch or a flood zone where they're not going to thrive. Silly. Second, identify wet areas on your farm. This includes seeps, boggy areas, springs, gullies, and eroding banks. If you do graze, you may need to prioritize fencing. You will need to set fences back at least 3 meters, but ideally to 5 meters on flat land and upwards of 10 meters if you have sloping land. This is a sufficient width to adequately filter sediment from any runoff. With fencing, you may still need to provide access across the stream, so consider adding culverts or bridges where relevant. The goal is to reduce the input of waste directly into the water, as well as minimize stream bed disturbance. So not crossing stock over waterways, and so by a bridge or culvert or otherwise helps reduce that as best as possible. Following the identification of the areas and prioritizing that fencing, you can go on to considering planting. You can start by just leaving rank grass. Let that grass grow, don't graze it. That's something. That is something better than nothing, and it still filters pollutants. But with just having rank grass, and without any kind of grazing, do consider that weeds may take off, so you'll need to factor in some weed control with that. But ideally, you'll be planning for planting in native species. They provide better habitat for aquatic and terrestrial animals, and as natives grow, they shade out most weed species, which is pretty handy. All right, biodiversity protection and enhancement, good management practices. We've got a couple more. But with this, you may be lucky enough to have bush blocks or wetlands on your property, or you may want to create these assets from scratch. These are precious resources for native insects, birds, and plants, and are a fantastic amenity area to enjoy. So your first step, if you have this, whether you are protecting or enhancing, is again fencing. If you have any kind of stock will graze on seedlings, impeding natural regeneration. Additionally, stock will often select certain species, resulting in an imbalance of the species that you do have regenerating. That can grazing animals may also impact soils and hydrology through pugging and compaction. There's sometimes a place for light grazing sheep for weed or fire control, but do consider phasing this out with increasing native plantings. Next, you want to be making sure that you're controlling weeds, but spending time controlling the ones that have the most impact. If you're not certain about what weeds you have or what vegetation you have in your bush block or biodiversity area, there are a couple of different ways that you can identify species. There's an app called Seek, which uses iNaturalist as a way to identify species. There's also Google Lens. There are innumerable Facebook groups specific even to New Zealand, where you can take a picture, post it up, and someone will help you identify it. Is it native? Is it a weed? From there, if you are not certain about some of your weeds, Weed Busters resource online is a great place to go. What are the weeds of greatest concern and how do you manage those? Another resource to consider is there's a recently produced Find a Pest app that feeds into Department of Conservation as well as the Regional Council. And it's a way that you can report potential weeds or other pests. And by reporting those, you may get some support in managing those weeds. And as a tag onto that, specifically for the West Coast, there's been recent funding about weed-free Taiputini, which is a Jobs for Nature scheme that focuses both on targeting specific weed species on the West Coast in public as well as private land. But they also are looking at blanket weed management for riparian planting, which could be available for private land. So a really cool way to look into enhancing some of your biodiversity protection in your particular block, wherever you are. If you're in a different region, check your regional council, check with other resources that either can help you provide some funding or support in managing your weeds and improving your biodiversity in your area. Depending on the size of your area, even small blocks can add biodiversity by having mixed species hedges to provide food sources and wildlife corridors. So wildlife corridors being areas of native vegetation that allow critters, birds, bats, etc., to move fluidly from one location to another. Birds, like the smaller pasturing birds that are here, have a hard time moving across a paddock. They can't fly that far. So a wildlife corridor is imperative for them moving from location to location to improve their biodiversity. And just a note that wetlands and wetted areas on private land are subject to council rules. So do remember that you may need to seek advice before altering any kind of wetland. Fertilizer and nitrogen use, good management practices. Biggest takeaway here is that fertilizer should not be applied within 5 meters of any waterway or in gullies. The buffer, even if it's only rank grass, acts as a filter, slowing down runoff and catching sediment and phosphate. And then our best advice really is to read and follow the label. It's worth getting your soil tested too, so you know you don't end up applying unnecessary fertilizer, as what the plants don't need will leach into the water table or waterways. And last one, infrastructure good management practices. Infrastructure can be actually one of the biggest source of pollutants and sediment. So whatever you're doing on your property, whatever size, whether you stock, whether you're horticulture, whether you just have a personal garden, we all have some sort of infrastructure that could potentially be managed or updated. So it's important that if you have tracks going through areas, they have good camber and good drainage, that you install bridges and culverts on tracks that go through waterways. And that isn't just for stock crossing. It's good management practices to be making sure that you've got bridges for regular crossings of, be it logging vehicles or your own vehicles going across the waterways where possible. It's just better for the waterways to have that. Finally, a failing wastewater system can lead to the release of pathogens and nutrients to streams, groundwater, and potentially swimming locations. So make sure your septic system and stockage field are well maintained and fit for purpose. All right, that is the end of the good management practices. Thanks for bearing with all of that. But that really was trying to just touch on the bare minimums there so that you can then reference back to, again, at the bottom of the template that you were provided are some links to additional resources that you can explore further as necessary or get in touch with any of the coordinators, and we'll do our best to support you in that. So there are a few others such as fire and waste, but we did feel that they're a bit more self-explanatory. So in the essence of time, we didn't cover those today. Your next task now is to complete your farm plan to assess which of the good management practices that we talked about are relevant to your land use practices and which you need to spend some more time on. This assessment will then lead to and help you formulate your action plan. Once you have gone through that entire table of your current practices and identified your critical source areas, it may seem a bit daunting and possibly like you've got a lot to tackle. So to start narrowing in on your priorities, one thing you can do is to assess the environmental risk and impact. So for any that are relevant, you can complete environmental risk analysis and your critical source areas. And you start by asking yourself, what is the likelihood of an impact occurring on this particular practice? Is my likelihood of an impact occurring unlikely or very likely? It's all going to be, I'm not even going to use an example here because it's going to be so dependent on what practices you have. But if you want to follow through with this a little bit later or have further questions, by all means, let me know. But what is the likelihood of an impact occurring? What is the scale of that impact? If this occurs, is your scale of impact negligible, moderate, or severe? Is it going to risk all kinds of fecal matter in a waterway? That would be a pretty severe impact. And then whatever you have decided is the likelihood and your impact, the intersection of where those two meet is going to be your, the intersection of the likelihood and impact is the environmental risk of that land management use practice or critical source area. By going through this process of doing an environmental risk analysis, this can help you maybe prioritize what are your biggest, riskiest actions that you have on your property, on your land, and maybe what do you need to prioritize? Maybe you already do prioritize those things, but maybe you've got quite a few on your list. What do you tackle first? Great, so you've now acknowledged what you know and do already, and perhaps have discovered what could be improved. There's even been the additional step of analyzing the level of environmental risk. This will now lead you to identifying the actions that need to be done. Your action plan is now the nuts and bolts. Remember, this is separate from your goals. Your action plan will then feed into your goals. Try and have actions as you think through everything that are achievable in a certain time frame. Some may be broken down further into manageable bites with a more in-depth plan. For example, planting. A planting plan, a separate planting plan is probably necessary. Planting is generally a multi-year process. It involves a lot of additional steps. So a separate further planting plan may be necessary, but some things are quite easy to add in your action plan. Try and prioritize the actions so you don't feel as overwhelmed. Sure, ideally critical source areas and practices with a really high environmental risk through our prior environmental risk analysis should be higher priority, but actions chosen and their priority is ultimately a personal choice based on what you have in terms of your available time, finances, or whatever means more to you. So ultimately, break it down to what's going to bring you the most joy, what's going to get you up in the morning and back on your farm and improving your environmental practices. Note that the cost and time frame in this particular table are both estimates to help with the prioritization process rather than necessarily set in stone facts. All right, next steps. Look at your property with farm environment plan eyes. We've gone through everything within the template. How do you look at your farm? How do you manage your environmental practices? What are the various practices that are the best for your various practices? And yeah, get out there and do it. Grab your gumboots, identify your critical source areas, and start completing your plan. In particular, get that map done, complete your goals, and start your assessment. Once you've completed that, you can go ahead and start with your actions if you're ready, or feel free to reach out to me, or if you've got a coordinator within your region, see if you can send them a contact and they can help you wherever they're able to help you complete your farm plan so that you've got something to maybe bring to your next catchment group meeting, or have it so that you are prepared to tackle things going forward. And that's everything I've got for our presentation here. If you have any questions so far, please chuck them in either the chat or the Q&A. Again, I can go back on any particular good management practices if you're interested in addressing any more of those in depth, or take a look at your farm environment plan template. There are a couple of locations that you can go in there to explore further any of those and start taking a look at your farm environment plan. I'll wait here a minute or two more to see if there are any questions that come through. Otherwise, I will say thank you guys very much for attending today. Hopefully you found this somewhat helpful and interesting. And at any point, feel free to send me an email. Let me know if you have any further questions. And not seeing anything come through yet. Oh, okay, thank you. Thanks, Vicki. All right, enjoy the rest of you guys' evening. Out here on the coast, it's a little bit overcast, but still a little bit of sunlight to get out for me out on the farm a little, or out, not in my garden. And hope you guys have good rest of your evening. Thanks again.